Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm a member of the Science Collaborative staff, and I'm here with Megan Brass today as well. We're glad you can join us for today's webinar on the modernization of coastal land use planning in Oregon with Jenni, Schmitt, and Jill Rolfe. Our speakers today will talk about the collaborative stakeholder engagement process driving the full assessment and provide a snapshot of the products and recommendations developed through this process. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. Webinars also feature projects from Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. Our next webinar is on Thursday, December 5th from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic will be leveraging system-wide monitoring program data for wetland research and management. Before we get started, I'd like to ask a couple of quick poll questions to get a sense for your familiarity with the NERRS and the Science Collaborative. Please respond when you see the poll at your screen. Looks like we've got a pretty varied breakdown today. That's good. It's nice to see some diversity in the audience here. So it looks like a few people at least partner with the reserves, and a lot of people have at least heard of the NERRS. That's good. We'll do one more poll question real quick. Interesting. Big government presence today. So welcome to everybody, and we're glad you could join us. For those of you who are new to the reserve system and Science Collaborative, we'll just provide a little bit of background. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a NOAA program in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. It's a network of 29 unique research reserves, which you can see on the map in front of you. Each reserve is protected for long-term research, water quality monitoring, education, and coastal stewardship. The reserve system's mission is to practice and promote stewardship of coasts and estuaries through innovative research, education, and training using a place-based system of protected areas. Reserves pursue their mission in a highly collaborative way, both with one another and with public, private, and community organizations at various levels. The Science Collaborative, which is the program I work for, is one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. It's currently housed in the University of Michigan through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. The research it supports is distinctive in a few ways. The projects support reserve management needs through highly collaborative research, integrating the end users of the research into the research process itself to produce outcome-oriented products, with the goal being research uptake and use. Just as the reserve system stresses engagement, we do so through our webinars. Jenni and Jill welcome your questions. You can send your questions via the questions box at any time, and our speakers will answer them during a question and answer period at the end of the webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Jenni Schmitt leads the planning and implementation of wetlands-related projects at the South Slough NERRS. As part of her work, Jenni has been coordinating collaborative projects with a community-based group of concerned citizens called the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds. Members of the group work collaboratively to develop locally driven approaches to responsible development and to help prepare for climate-related changes on Oregon's south coast. Jill Rolfe has worked for the Coos County Planning Department for 18 years and has been the director since 2012. She regularly coordinates research and updates to the county comprehensive plan with local, state, and federal agencies. She has been a member of the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds for 6 years and played a large advisory role for environmental and socioeconomic aspects of multiple projects. Jill is also coordinating updates to several estuary management plans. Jenni will be starting us off today, so I'll turn it over to her now. Jenni, go ahead.
All right. So So, good afternoon, everyone. Today, Jill and I wanted to talk to you about how to modernize land use plans while keeping a balance between economic development, natural resource protection, and then social and cultural interests. As I'm sure you are all aware, land use planning can be confusing and sometimes contentious in a community because land use affects the quality of everyone's life and everyone has different values. So, today we're going to take you through our process in updating a land use plan in Oregon, specifically the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan as an example. Jill will start by giving an overview of the history of Oregon's estuary planning process, and then I'll follow with the specific details of our project. Throughout, we're going to highlight the importance of collaborative stakeholder steering committees to guide planning processes. And then at the end, we'll discuss the lessons that we've learned from our process that might be applicable to you. So with that, I'm going to let Jill start.
Okay, thank you. See if I can get the screen to work. Here we go. So, Oregon estuary planning history. Just to give kind of a brief overview of Oregon planning history. In 1973, Oregon Land Use Planning Act, Senate Bill 100, came into effect. Estuary specifically called out in Senate Bill 100 for special considerations in writing the goals. So there are 19 statewide planning goals that basically make up the land use planning system in Oregon. Goals, statewide planning goals 16 and 17 are mostly focused on estuary planning, with goal 18 also playing a role in it, but not the same amount of role as goal 16 and 17. Goal 16 is your actual estuarine resources. It's actually the water area. Goal 17 complements that with the upland zoning of your shorelands. So those work together to make sure that we're providing that balance that Jenni was talking about. So in the 1980s, the local comprehensive plan was completed and approved. This means that we started that, when I say we, Coos County through a task force with the city of Coos Bay, the city of North Bend, who also have jurisdiction over the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan in portions in their area, along with several other agencies, worked through a task force to put the plan together. It started in the late 70s, and it wasn't acknowledged by the Land Conservation and Development Commission until 1984, and it went into effect in 1986. So Oregon's framework for estuary planning, Goal 16. Goal 16 basically gives you the framework for how estuary plans need to be developed. It sets priorities for conservation and development, applies system-wide spatial planning approaches. So in Goal 16, there's three different sets of, there's a natural areas, which basically have a little to no development in it. They're protected areas. They're conservation areas, which kind of are those mid-range areas where they still have protections that need to be applied, but then there is some uses that actually happen within those zoning areas. And then there's development areas. And development areas are going to be like your shipping areas and stuff like that. Goal 17, your protection for habitat and other resources, reserved for unique shoreland uses, recognizes natural hazards, and protects public access. So Goal 17 was developed to basically complement Goal 16. So whatever you have in your water area going on, you look at your upland area, and that's kind of how you develop the zoning in that area. There are several protections that also happen in Goal 17, and so you have to look at those, what we refer to as inventories, to see what those protected areas are and how best to manage those. So elements of your local city and county comprehensive plans. Again, the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan is a very large plan that goes through 3 different jurisdictions. That's why it's important that we have that we work with our partners to make sure that if one change is made in one plan, that it's actually consistently done through the other plans, so those protections remain in place. So decisions made in advance of the system-wide. Some of the decisions were actually made based on what's in Goal 16. So it's not that the local jurisdiction didn't have a say in what happens within their plan, but some of those, if the inventories told you that this is what it was supposed to be developed at, those were already made. And again, the units that I kind of talked about before are listed below: the natural, conservation, and development. Natural, again, is for mostly protection. So those are going to be your areas that have high resource protections needed for environmental. And then you have your conservation, which kind of has a mix. So there, maybe it's not as needed for natural, but it still needs to be preserved. And then you have your development area, which is, again, would be like your shipping areas or your higher development areas. So your natural areas include your tidal marsh areas, your intertidal flats, and your seagrass and algae beds. Those are areas that are needed to be protected for resource importance. So again, those are the areas that basically they're meant for either research or areas for recreation, but not recreation in the form of actually changing the landscape, but just actually viewing. So maybe bird viewing or fishing or something like that, where you don't actually have to make an alteration to the area. Conservation tracks a significant habitat smaller of less biological importance than the natural units. So maybe there are some areas that have clam beds, or there may be even minor pockets of eelgrass or something that needs to be protected, but it's not at the same level as the natural areas. So areas are partially altered for adjacent to existing development, moderate intensity, which do not include the which do not possess the resource characteristics of the natural or the development units. The natural units are the most important that we protect, because that is actually where we've actually designated the resources, such as the eelgrass and seagrasses that we talked about before, actually live. So management unit identification. So your development area, again, that's going to be more your intensive, your shipping area, and these pictures kind of show you the marinas and the shipping areas that we have in our area. So we have a deep water area adjacent or in approximate to the shoreline. So we do have a deep draft navigational channel that runs through Coos Bay. Subtidal areas for in-water disposal of dredged material. Areas of minimal biological significance needed for uses requiring alterations of the Coos Bay or of the estuary not considered natural or conservation areas. So they may actually have some sort of inventory in this area, but it's been considered either minimal of biological significance, or when the plan was developed, there were areas that were increased to be more natural to offset the development. Oregon estuary planning results in coast-wide resource-based estuary management. Decisions on conservation and development were made in advances system-wide. Plans emphasize maintaining natural functions, protecting habitat, focusing on development into existing developed areas. So that's the other important thing. When Coos County and the city of Coos Bay and the city of North Bend put the plans together, one of the things that they did is they went through and identified areas that were already intensely developed, and they tried to keep the development in those areas because they were already the impacted areas. So the issues that we face, most of the plans are now 30 plus years old. Much of the development anticipated has not occurred or has already been developed. Plans do not incorporate current resource data and mapping technologies. So, over the years, we've gone through, several changes as far as mapping technologies and the data and the resources that have been collected. We're fortunate to have South SLU, Oregon Institute of Marine Biology in our area. There's several watersheds that are also collecting data, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so all that data didn't was sitting out there. So part of this plan, part of our current plan moving forward was to try to bring the data in. So that's what it says about it's not incorporating the current resource and mapping technology. So the Coos County Comprehensive Plan has only went through one revision, and that was in the late 1990s. And when I say one revision, that's one major revision. And the revision basically just went through to make sure that all the legal aspects were covered, but it didn't actually adopt any new inventories. When I say inventories, those are the mapped areas that cover the resources that are actually happening right now in the estuary. So what is the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan? So it's a written plan with mapped data used in the current decision making, includes procedural to review proposed estuarine development. So for instance, if somebody wanted to come in and do a development in the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan, we would go to these written documents, and that's how we would make a determination if that development was consistent with the plan. Changed conditions. Why do we need to do a revision to the plan? As you see, that top picture is from 1970. That's again when the plan was developed, was kind of through the 1970s, and with it being adopted in the early 80s. This is a large mill facility that no longer exists. The 2016 picture shows you actually what exists on that site. It's not necessarily taken from the same angle, but it's the same piece of property. Currently, it has a casino and an RV park. So basically, it was converted from an intensive mill to a recreational facility. So why do we need to do the revisions? Obviously, because as shown in the pictures, the development that happened 40 years ago obviously is not the development that's happening now. So the main drivers 40 years ago in our area were timber, fishing, and agricultural uses. And I would say those are still some of our main drivers, but we've looked at it and we really need to consider what other drivers are in our area. So we have developed in earlier years tourism, a bigger tourism base, recreational uses such as kayaking, and then social considerations have also changed. You know, if you think about it, we've changed a lot over the past 40 years. So we changed how we buy goods, we've changed how we recreate, how we socialize, and all those factors need to be considered in a current plan. So the beginning steps for the revisions, planning ahead, research how plans were originally developing, and then budget planning. So the original plan was very expensive to put together. It was very time consuming. And so we had to look at how the original plan was put together to be able to plan ahead and see how other plans maybe have been revised and what budget concerns came up. We assembled a team, so we had technical assistants, stakeholder steering committees. It's very similar to the process that was used in the original task force that was set up that assembled the original plan. Finding people who care. We all have people that we've asked to sit on committees and volunteer their time, and it is difficult. People are busy. So finding people who care in different categories was a little bit harder than I think we anticipated. But we did find people that were in the natural resource managers, business industrial interests, land use planners and coastal managers, researchers and educators, and recreational interests.
All right, I think
So.
I'll take over, I guess, the controls.
Okay.
Okay. So I should mention that stakeholders on any kind of citizen or any sort of stakeholder committee, you can include citizen advisors and planning commissioners, but they shouldn't be the sole stakeholders representing a planning project. You need that diversity of background and interest to provide a necessary depth to the feedback that you want to receive. And it's with the understanding that not everyone is well versed in estuary policies or land use processes, but they still need to inform those revisions. So the stakeholder group that largely led the process that I'm about to describe in the Coos Estuary, that stakeholder group is called the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds, PCW, I might say on accident, but I'll try not to steer clear of acronyms. But it's a local group of civic-minded community members with ties to the community that have a mission to collaborate to understand local watershed conditions and address their capacity and resiliency to serve ecological, economic, and social needs for present and future generations. So from the list of individuals in the group that you see here that led our particular project, it was composed of city and county planners, natural resource managers, development conservation interests. And this group basically guided our project to help improve estuary management. So it reflects the modern socioeconomic drivers while proactively protecting natural resources. There we go. So what I'm going to describe now is the process that the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds took. Like I said, they mainly steered this whole project. So their intent was to help ensure that an updated plan reflects the current economic, environmental, and sociocultural needs of the broader community through four main ways: basically assessing the existing plan, amassing all of that current information that Jill talked about that now exists, engage the broader community, and then evaluate options and recommendations for decision makers in our area. So I'll go through this in a little bit of detail, and I'll start with assessing the existing plan. So the first step was this audit, basically an audit of the existing Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan. Planners and others who use the plan regularly were interviewed to evaluate where the legal framework may have changed since this plan was created, and also so that we could understand implications of any legal decisions that have occurred since the plan was adopted. And then finally, they gave feedback on the general usability of the plan. And so the report that came out of this describes key recommendations for how the plan could be improved, and showing here some of those recommendations. So developing a user guide for the plan, simplifying the language, explicitly stating the policy hierarchies, including permit application diagrams, including GIS-based maps, and digitizing the plan. So these really focus on that plan usability and how that can be improved. So this provided us a nice outline of where the plan could benefit from improvement. So we'll talk about how we amassed the kind of the existing current information. We developed two primary information sources that the county and other local jurisdictions could use to update the inventories that Jill talked about, basically the information or data portion of the plan. The current inventories that are being used now in decisions were created and compiled in the 1970s. And as Jill said, a lot's changed since then. So as the first step towards updating the information in the inventories, the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds directed the development of the Community Lands and Waterways data source. This is an encyclopedic compilation of all the data in the area that describes the socioeconomic and environmental conditions. Chapters describe present-day status and trends of resources and profiles of the surrounding community. So each chapter has a data summary, which talks about status and trends, a description of where the data came from, how much confidence we should have in that data, what data gaps were highlighted in this process, and then a description of how climate change may affect each attribute. So there were 18 chapters in all, assessing biological, physical, and socioeconomic systems. and it included things like weather or water quality, landslide hazards, to what are the status of endangered species in our area, to invasive species. And then looking at the community, jobs and employment trends, and schools and education. So profiles on how those things are doing. So that's available online at the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds website. The second step is to updating the information was the development of the Coos Estuary and Shoreline Atlas. And this provides the current socioeconomic and environmental data from the area in a map and tabular form. So this includes socioeconomic data, designated land uses that already exist, ecological features, hazards, infrastructure, areas for restoration and recreation. Most of the data that went into this was collected after the existing plan was adopted. For example, no one was thinking about tsunami inundation zones back in the 1970s. And then, as Jill mentioned, mapping technologies have made remarkable improvements since the 1980s. And so the current plan was created with hand-drawn maps, but those are still what the county is using to make their land use decision. So this map atlas would ideally help replace that. And the products include large dimensional paper maps, which the jurisdictions can use, as well as a geodatabase that contains all of the spatial data. And this is just showing you an example of one of those large-scale paper maps that was provided. So this is showing tidal wetland landward migration zone areas in the Coos Estuary. So basically where marshes have the ability to migrate to in a 4.7-foot sea level rise scenario. So that's just an example. Other maps included physical features like tsunami inundation or sea level rise zones, and biological features like eelgrass and oyster beds, and then a lot of socioeconomic attributes like zoning and management units and mitigation sites and improvement status. All right, so the next thing is engaging the broader community. So I want to note that the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds gave feedback throughout this project and really drove the whole process that was taken. However, once we amassed all of that information that I just described, the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds also wanted to engage the broader community to kind of get a litmus test for how other people thought about what we were doing. So we did this in several ways. So we pulled in local experts from the community who could speak to one of three perspectives: economic development, natural resource protection and restoration, or sociocultural interests. And so these became our stakeholder focus groups. We hosted a series of workshops that resulted in recommendations from each of the three focus groups on the priorities and opportunities that they felt were important for an updated estuary management plan. And then recommendations from these groups can now help ensure that the updated plan reflects the present day drivers in terms of economy and the environment and the sociocultural needs of the broader community. And then at the bottom, you'll see an example of one of the recommendations, just to give you a sense for what these recommendations look like. This came from the Natural Resource Protection Group, and it says, encourage the maintenance or rehabilitation of existing derelict infrastructure to either preserve its use for future development needs or for when it has habitat significance, otherwise promote removal. And this is speaking to the fact that there's a lot of derelict piers and docks along the shoreline that were originally built for economic purposes, but never were realized, or they've degraded since. And so they're basically suggesting that if it has habitat value, keep it, and if there's a value for a future development need, keep it, otherwise get rid of it. So that's just an example. The group also wanted to get the perspective from an even wider portion of the community through hosting a public open house. So the open house included presentations on who and what the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds Steering Committee is, presentations on statewide planning goals, presentation on the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan and what that is. And then we had information stations set up around the room so people could get some really in-depth look at that communities, lands, and waterways data source, that encyclopedic compilation that I talked about, and also a station for people to get a close look on the Coos Estuary Map Atlas products. People could look at the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan audit, and then people also had an opportunity to hear about the recommendations that came out of the focus groups. And so we also wanted to understand how what we were doing was in line with what the rest of the community thought. So we gave each participant to the open house a survey to understand what's their experience using the plan, what interest groups do they most associate with in terms of economic, natural resource, or sociocultural, and then how well do they agree with the focus group recommendations. And this pie chart here is just showing you one of the results. This came from the question on which interest group they associated most closely with, and you can see economic, sociocultural, and people that identified with multiple interest groups were about the same, and then natural resource protection kind of led the participation in that open house. So I thought it would be interesting right now to give the same question to the audience right now to, number one, wake you up a little bit. And I just thought it'd be fun to compare this audience with the public open house participants. So take a minute and answer this poll question. All right, so yeah, a lot of natural resource protection. I kind of thought that would be the case. And no economic development. So a little bit biased, but it's good to know your audience. All right, so maybe you've refreshed yourself a little bit. So moving on. The third way that we wanted to kind of engage a broader perspective was to solicit technical review on the process we were taking. So we have a report that you can see here, and I believe there's a link available in the chat box. There's handouts available. So basically, this is the Coos Estuary Land Use Analysis Report, which describes our entire process. But we wanted to make sure that the process we took was a balanced approach. So we solicited feedback from regional experts from one of four categories: economic development, natural resource protection, sociocultural needs, and then statewide planning goals. And these people, we wanted to make sure they didn't have a vested interest in this particular process, but they were experts in their field. So we had several quotes. I'll show you. This is our economic development expert who said the plan clearly needs to be brought into the 21st century. Our policy analyst expert said the report is thorough and provides an excellent foundation to support next steps in the modernization of the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan. And then our sociocultural expert said the report communicates effectively about the project and processes engaging staff, consultants, and the public. So this is an idea of their support for the work that we did. But we did receive quite a bit of good insight and recommendations from our technical reviewers that we incorporated into the report, the finalized report, as much as possible. So then the last piece of this was to evaluate some options and provide scenarios and recommendations to our local decision makers. So we provided an analysis of options that included associated trade-offs like costs, technical feasibility, political viability, administrative ease, and efficacy. And we basically provided an outline for technical guidance and implementation for three options. There was a full plan revision option, a partial plan revision option, and then a no change option. So the no change option is basically keep the plan as is, or at least maybe digitize the plan. It's not changing it, but it's making it a little bit more user-friendly. This option cost the least, but it also had the lowest impact. A partial revision, the county could adopt small plan amendments. For example, they could update just the inventories portion of the plan, that information source using the Communities, Lands, and Waterways data source or the Coos Estuary Map Atlas as the foundations. And then the third option is to do a full revision where they would review individual zonings and potentially make changes. This option would be the costliest, but also have the greatest impact. So in June, we had a joint jurisdictional meeting with the city councilors from both cities, the county commissioners, as well as the planning commissioners from all three jurisdictions. And we presented the project and the findings that I kind of presented here today. And after that, the decision makers gave verbal consensus to move forward with a partial revision now and a full revision in the future. So that was exciting. But no jurisdiction in Oregon has yet done a major revision to their estuary management plan. So we wanted to kind of jumpstart it by developing a framework that would allow integration of new information into existing plans, whether that's updating the information inventories or adding new narratives. And so our consultants analyzed inconsistencies between the adopted plan and ordinances and highlighted those and gave recommendations on how to change the language. They made recommendations on how to integrate newly compiled information into the plan, and in our case, this was incorporating the Map Atlas and the Community Lands and Waterways data source into the plan as the new information sources. Recommendations on making the plan more user-friendly, like hyperlinking it and digitizing it, and then laying the groundwork for cross-jurisdictional coordination and collaboration. So 3 jurisdictions are affected by the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan, as Jill said earlier, with Coos County as the lead jurisdiction. So we wanted to make sure that a revised plan is something all 3 jurisdictions agree with and will adopt. And so where we're at right now is the county is moving forward with a partial revision to the Coos Bay Estuary Management Plan. It's about a 3-month process and includes its own public review period, and it'll begin in January. So I'm going to end with some lessons that we've learned through this process that might be useful for you. We've developed a lessons guide that might help other planners that are interested in revising plans. And again, this is probably a link in the chat box, and there's a handout of this guide in the handout box on your webinar panel. But basically, the lessons guide provides a background on a brief overview of Oregon land use plan and update processes, beginning steps, so things to consider when you're first gonna go about updating a plan or begin a plan. What our process was, the Partnership for Watersheds process. So this is broken into cumulative steps that can each be a distinct phase. And each step is broken into an overview of that step, breakdowns of benefits and costs, and then other considerations to bear in mind. And then we have a section on just general considerations, so best practices and circumstances to be aware of. For example, sometimes when you're using interest groups, focus groups, or steering committees, you might have different interest groups that potentially conflict. So in these cases, it works really well to set a foundation of commonality and values. So for example, in our case, everyone could speak to the importance of a healthy estuary for everyone, and everyone could acknowledge that there is an interconnectedness between economic health, sociocultural health, and the health of our natural resources. So setting that commonality stage. So this section describes things like that. And then finally, we have a resources section. So products that I've described in this webinar, contact information for Jill, Rolfe, and myself, subcontractors that we used, and then grant funding opportunities.
All right. Thank you for that. That was awesome.
Yeah, I did
I'll
want to
take
say though, I had a thank you slide that didn't show up, but I did want to thank the funders, which is the NERRS Science Collaborative, along with Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. They both provided money for this. Also, thanks to our subcontractor team, which was the University of Oregon's Institute for Policy Research and Engagement, and that was led by Michael Howard. And then a really huge thank you to our steering committee, the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds members, who really drove this entire process through their dedication. So with that, we'll take questions.
Just as a reminder, you can type your questions into the questions part of the Q&A console on the GoToWebinar console, and we will go ahead and read them aloud as they come in.
We've got one question that's come in so far. What will be the largest challenges moving forward regarding the implementation of the newly revised plan?
Jill,
So,
that one.
yeah. So the major challenge is that all three jurisdictions actually have to adopt the plan. And so even though that we have the buy-in from the three jurisdictions, which was very, very important, we still have to get there. So that is probably the most challenging because you're going to have different views from different jurisdictions, but it's important that we stay focused and we move forward as a group because the plan was meant to be for, of course, one estuary. To divide it into jurisdictional boundaries makes sense for jurisdictions maybe, but not necessarily the estuary. So that's probably the largest challenge. That and funding to go through with the full revision.
So as others are jotting down their questions and entering them into the console, we here at the Science Collaborative have a question for you. We're curious to know what surprised you as a part of this project at the beginning, the end, or as you're reflecting on it now. What's something that surprised you and throughout the project?
I can start. So I thought something that was kind of interesting was when we had the three focus groups that had very different focus on their interests. So economic development versus natural resource protection versus just sociocultural interests. The result of those and all the recommendations, I thought there would be a lot of conflicting recommendations, and honestly, a lot of it really flowed well together, and we didn't have any conflicts whatsoever in terms of the recommendations that we got from those groups. So that was a really nice surprise.
And I would have to agree with Jenni. After reading the background of how the original plan came together and the length of time it took, they started at the end of the 70s and didn't really finish that project until 1982. So I felt like we were probably going to follow those same steps by doing the focus groups because, often economic interest and conservation interest, those are two different ends of the spectrum. So I really thought that there would be more conflict between those, but they actually, again, surprisingly, there weren't. I mean, they all kind of meshed together. There was an understanding that we needed those, and I think that is in part by having that foundation that we started with that Jenni talked about.
Thanks. We have another question that's rolled in. Did you identify and consider protection of pathways for tidal wetlands to migrate?
So we definitely have basically that was the example map that I showed was the landward migration zone mapping. So that's now information that the county can use and the other local jurisdictions can use when they're making their decisions once that all gets adopted. But the specific language for the various parcels themselves, that would be part of a full revision. And Jill can probably speak to that a little bit more.
Right. Basically, I echo exactly what Jenni said, that the language isn't currently in there, but we're moving forward with that. The first thing is to have the actual maps adopted into, and when we talk about inventories are the maps and the scientific data that actually gets incorporated into the plan. And then you develop the policies that that implement what to do with those inventories and how to protect them, or if they need to be protected. That's talked more about in the policies. So the policy part is part of the full revision, which will be our next step, hopefully.
Maybe as we're wrapping up, maybe we could continue if there's anything else you might share about next steps for where this work is headed, and things you all are planning on doing to keep up the momentum.
So next steps are to move forward with the adoption of the partial revision for the county, and then the cities will follow suit. And then I'm going to let Jenni kind of talk about where we're at with moving forward with the larger picture, the bigger revision.
So yeah, as a group, the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds was talking about a climate change vulnerability assessment, like I mentioned. And then there's also some pieces that we identified as data gaps through this process. So one of those happened to be mitigation lands. And so areas that have been set aside for mitigation. Again, this is 40 years ago or more, and so some of those have either passively restored or maybe there's no longer any ecological uplift in those areas. And so basically reassessing and broadening it from mitigation to just restoration opportunities in general in the Coos Estuary. And so we're moving forward with a grant proposal to find funding to basically refine our habitat classification that's at kind of the state level right now into more of a local level, so it's a little bit higher resolution, and then use that to develop a restoration potential inventory for the Coos Estuary. And so that would help inform a full revision as well. I don't know if you have anything else, Jill, that you want to add.
Yeah, I would just add that we make sure that we have monthly meetings just to keep the momentum going. And Jenni does a great job of heading that up, putting the agendas together. We keep in contact with everybody just to make sure that, that it keeps on track. And we've been working on exploring different funding ideas and where to go. And I think there's been a lot of volunteer time incorporated into this, which is great to see from our community. So I think that's why it keeps going, is just because we have such a good community push to see the plan come into meet the current needs of our community.
Our time is about up, so just a couple comments before we adjourn. Thank you to everyone for participating in the webinar today. Please keep an eye out for future webinar announcements. We have many interesting projects wrapping up over the coming months that will be sharing their findings and lessons learned. A couple panel webinars in development as well that look across several projects, so keep an eye out for those. To follow along, you can sign up for webinar announcements as part of the exit survey that follows this webinar. And be sure to check out the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webpage to download new webinar briefs as they become available, and view webinar recordings as they become available. And we'll end with a big thank you to Jenni and Jill for taking the time to be with us today and share some of their work with us. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for listening.